like to welcome you to our podcast, our DocGo podcast, to talk about the 10 bold predictions of how AI is going to dramatically impact healthcare. My name is Dr. Ben Bobrow. I'm honored to be part of the DocGo Medical Advisory Board, and I'm an emergency physician by training with over 30 years of experience working in all types of different emergency departments. And I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Jim Powell. Jim, I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself in just a sec. And Dr. Ries Robinson. And we were part of a group that co-authored a white paper recently that was entitled Beyond the Hype, How AI Can Improve Healthcare Today and Transform Its Future. And our mission today is let's unpack the 10 bold predictions and give some thought and some of our opinions and discussions on this. So first, Jim, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here.
Sure. So Jim Powell, primary care doctor by training, and also like to think I'm a change agent for healthcare that really have a focus on transformation in the health systems, but also thinking about patient-centric innovation so that we really think about the care and that we support our patients. So my background as an internist has really been in the Medicaid underserved world and the FQHCs and those types of patient populations. So a real passion for making sure everyone has access, engagement to the services that we provide. So excited to kind of explore this, but be conscious of that these are great opportunities to be part of AI, but we all have to be conscious of the responsibility that we'll discuss a little bit later today. Ries?
So Ries Robinson, I'll bring kind of the technology perspective a little bit to this. So an engineer and then went to medical school, but I spent really my entire career sort of in the area of innovation, both medical device and then was the Chief Innovation Officer at Presbyterian Healthcare Services. So really always looking at that intersection of care and technology and how does it create benefit without harm.
You know, one of the things I really like about sort of our setup here is that we're going to be looking at AI and healthcare from a few different perspectives, a few very different perspectives. One is sort of my background in acute care and urgent care medicine. Yours in chronic care and primary care and internal medicine.
Playing the long game.
Playing the long game. Yeah. And then Ries, your perspective and your background insights on looking at all this from a technology perspective. So I think we got a lot of it covered.
Yeah, be fun.
All right, so again, our goal is to unpack these 10 bold predictions that were set out in the white paper. So let's jump in. We'll start with the first prediction, which was that AI will drive proactive guardianship. What does that mean to you guys?
What I think is, I sort of look at that and I think, when you say proactive guardianship, is there a structure in which you think about it? And I often go back to sort of the Hippocratic Oath, which is clinical responsibility. And how do you think about the development of artificial intelligence within the framework of clinical responsibility, do no harm? But remember, within the Hippocratic Oath is that phrase of practicing best medicine possible. And that's really making sure that AI is used to facilitate the quality of healthcare delivery. So I think the Hippocratic Oath serves as a good governing guardianship principle to say, okay, if what we're doing fits within that framework, then it's probably good. And if you're doing something that doesn't, you might ought to think about it a little more.
Jim, what do you think?
I almost use, from the primary care perspective, I always think about the annual wellness visit for my patients, and the idea is we want to collect historical data to really document a patient's chronic diseases and to think about the new and emerging conditions. We use this point in time to really pull a story together. And so when I think about that kind of proactive approach is how am I leveraging what's already been available for us in a constructive way and help me predict the future of the things that are going to evolve, based on patient-specific conditions. So I kind of use that example of allowing me to kind of feel like that's going to help bridge the pre and the post. It's a whole input, processing, output of that experience.
The term proactive, I've thought about this for a long time, actually for decades. In my specialty, we see patients often, over and over and over. And people always say to me, wow, it must have always different things coming in the emergency room. It's always very different. But it's remarkably similar, the types of stories. The people, the faces change, but the stories are very similar in that something happened and patients kind of drifted off a treatment plan. And it doesn't happen like that. It usually happens over time. I'm going to give you an example. This is incredibly common, something we saw over and over and over. And I know you saw things in your practice kind of in a very similar thing. But so one of the major public health problems we have today is falls, patient falls. And we'd have, a typical patient, 65-year-old gentleman who came in, sometimes, fell down, sometimes had a laceration, sometimes had a wrist fracture, sometimes even more severe, had a hip fracture, sometimes really severe, not uncommon, had a head injury. And you think if you kind of go back and would dig in a little bit, you talk to the family and the patient, you find out that oftentimes, they were having some difficulty with dizziness. This was really common.
Yes.
And then a really common thing, if you went a little deeper, was, well, they actually had high blood pressure and their primary care doctor was managing their blood pressure. And they recently increased their blood pressure medicine. And sometimes their blood pressure was really difficult to treat, so they gave them another blood pressure medicine. And then the patient ended up hypotensive, had a syncope, and had all these downstream things. And I always thought, gosh, we should have been able to predict that. We should have been able to monitor that and actually prevent all the downstream, morbidity and sometimes mortality that happened with that. And to me, that's that's sort of a example of proactive. We should be able to monitor, and we can. Technically, we can monitor these things, and we should be able to intervene way earlier, as opposed to this. Our practice of medicine really for centuries has been very responsive, reactive. We're gonna patch you up after something happens, but it's really inefficient, and it's really costly. And in fact, when you look at things, some of the major public health problems we have, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, our treatments, our responsive treatments, are not great. Yeah, we can sort of rescue people and save them, but there are all kinds of negative things have happened by then. And so way, way, way more effective and cost effective and better for everyone if we could go upstream and predict these things. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of in the proactive mindset. That's what I think AI, one of the things I think AI, one of the great hopes of it is that it can help us finally achieve that.
Yeah. But I tie in the on the serve community, we just make sure there's got to be equity around it. Like we got to make sure that we're going to support all patients through this process. So as you get as further upstream as possible, we want to make sure that everyone is involved in that process, all providers, all patients. So I'm excited to see it work out.
Yeah, I think equity is definitely one of the big themes that we'll talk about as we go through all the different bold predictions. So let's move on to number 2. Ries, you want to introduce this bold prediction?
Yeah, the topic we've got there is hyper-personalization of medicine. And I think it's a little bit what you were just talking about is how do we know the individual? And I thought about this topic a little bit and had a friend recently who had a diagnosis and kind of 50% survival rate. And I thought about it and I thought, wow, in today's day and age, we can't identify the cancer effectively to understand actually what is the survival rate. And then you dig into it just a little further and you'd say, well, why is that? And a lot of it is there's a wealth of information, clinical notes, genomic data, et cetera, but a lot of it is siloed within a cancer institute or a healthcare system. There's no real ability to aggregate it across the totality of every person that's had cancer and use privacy-preserving tools to examine that. So often I think about, this seeing that hyper-personalization come together, I think we have the algorithms. What we actually don't have is the data upon which to apply them to create the degree of resolution that really is transformative in cancer. I don't know if you guys have a similar view, but I'd love to unpack it a little bit.
Well, I look at it also as the idea of, to me, the personalization is also the obstacles of that individual. So whether it's social determinants of healthcare, access, engagement, because the medical, the therapeutic, the surgical regimen may be ideal, but there's variabilities in the outcome based on the experience or the ability to get those services. So, what I get excited about is thinking about, well, where do we identify the areas of friction? Where do we identify the places that we can improve upon so we can get to that ultimate goal of those outcomes? And I think that's where we can help, again, raise the tide for all.
It always seemed so imperfect to me the way we structure treatments for people. For example, we have, for lots of people, we'll try the same dosage of a medicine based on maybe their weight. Well, maybe we'll change it a little bit based on their weight or their age. But it's sort of like just looking and we're kind of, okay, we're guessing at it. And oftentimes, providers, we'll try something. Let's see how it works. If it doesn't work, we'll try one treatment or one medication, you give it a few weeks, see how it works, then we might change to something. It's very much trial and error. Right. With AI, I don't think we need to be doing that. It's much more, and we'll have so much more ability to tailor treatments to people. And that's really what I think is very exciting and what's going to help people enormously.
Yeah, that's a great point. I used to take care of a lot of patients with disabilities, developmental disabilities. And quite often, the bell-shaped curve of normal labs or normal doses did not apply to that patient population. They'd have basal temperatures of 94. So they get to 98 and they're like, oh, there's no fever. Well, they just went up, 4 degrees. That's dramatic. Or a dose being intoxicated from a dose. So that's an excellent point that I think we have to really focus in on.
Yeah, and like what you said is about genomics. You mentioned genomics at the very beginning. People talk about how AI in precision medicine looks at all the omics, genomics, proteomics, microbiomics, not just your genes, but also your environment and the bacteria that are both inside us and around us and our proteins, and can really, really take a laser beam, focus on what's the best treatment for this person at this time in their exact situation. What's going to help them the most?
Right. I liked how that conversation just went, because it went from AI being involved in defining the diagnosis with accuracy. And then it went to how does it become involved in creating the treatment that's appropriate for the individual person. And then how is it involved in ensuring that individual can actually manage the treatment. Mm-hmm. So you go diagnosis, tailored treatment, tailored care.
Right. And we're going to talk about that whole issue about treatment compliance and monitoring patients, and there's a lot that goes into that, and we'll talk about that also. Good. So should we move on to number 3? Jim?
Sure. So this prediction number 3 is the patient-centric revolution. And the idea for me is that when I think about patients, it's all about through a concept of wellness, the medical, the behavioral, the social, and the financial wellness of the individual. So if we're going to be patient-centric in our approach and the way we design care and deliver care, we want to focus on making sure we're helping that individual for all aspects of their life. So I'd love to get your take on what you think about that.
It's something I've thought a lot about is how does that patient manage their situation? And had the opportunity to work with the individual that was really responsible for Home Depot's enormous effort in do-it-yourself tools and what they've been able to do. And the idea there was to educate, empower, and enable people to do what they didn't think they could do through a series of videos and tools. And I look at it and say, okay, what's the ability to do that for patients with chronic disease? Because many of them understand the nuances of their condition and the idiosyncrasies and what they really did better than the physician or nurse that's involved in it. So if you think about that, educate, equip, and empower. And it can be the patient themselves or the unpaid caregiver, the family or the spouse that facilitates in it. And I keep thinking that's the avenue by which I think AI and AI tools can have a profound effect on the individual, is to empower them to do a better job taking care of their disease condition with terminology and information that's comfortable for them. Now, it doesn't mean you're mitigating the physician. What you're doing is you're also using those tools to define when a physician should be involved or when the variances are acceptable. So I've watched that transition. If you ever get on their website, it's fascinating, and say, okay, how do we bring that process of enabling people to care for themselves in the best possible manner?
That's interesting. Sort of the whole self-efficacy thing, but with fixing up your house, fixing up your home, is very similar to fixing yourself up. People need to actually believe they can do it. I think people get a little off topic, and I understand why, when we talk about AI, and a lot of people are afraid that it's really going to replace the clinician.
Right.
I personally don't think it will, and hope and it can't. It can empower the clinician. It can free the clinician to do really what what you've done for years and years, and you're so focused as a primary care doctor on that patient physician bond that's so powerful, and that's what gets to the this enabling patients. I don't think an AI tool is really going to be super powerful in enabling patients. I see AI, in the information it can provide, but the physician helping empower the patient to take control of something. I had a brilliant mentor for many years, Dr. Carl Hammerschlag. He passed away a few years ago. He was a psychiatrist. And he used to talk about the difference between a patient having a condition and the condition having a patient. So lots of times you'll hear a patient say, this has really got me, that whatever chronic disease, my congestive heart failure, it's got me. I can't seem to get away from it. As opposed to, you flip that on its head, which I've got it. The patient has it, that I can manage it, I can control it, I'm going to make the best out of it no matter what it is. It's a mindset thing. And I think that's a big mindset that, AI can provide advantages, data, feedback, monitoring, all these things that we're going to talk about. And it has to get back. Patients still have to be the stewards of their care. Right. AI is not going to, you can't sit there, just cure me, make me better. It doesn't work like that. And if we think it does, we're going to go way off track, getting way too reliant on technology and data. In my opinion, that's the exact wrong way to go. And I don't think we're going to do that, and I think a lot of people see that we shouldn't do that. But can it help us get back to, as you say, self-efficacy, where someone says they know how to use these tools, whether they're Home Depot tools or other tools that they've gotten to help themselves.
Yeah, that's what's so powerful, the concept of the quality touch, right? So you want to embrace the patient and give them advice, and then you're going to see them 3 months later.
I know you talk about quality touches a lot. I like that.
And just like, if we're using technology or AI bots or whatever to kind of keep those quality touches going across and in between the sessions, then you can embrace change, because then you feel like you can own the process, because you're reminded in a proactive way of helping facilitate improvement, as opposed to your point, which is excellent. CHF has me. Yeah. And then I'm doomed, right? Then I'm never changing, because that's a fixed mindset. We got to use these quality touches to kind of create that growth mindset to kind of really push up.
Yeah, I like you talk about that a lot. I've noticed the quality touches, and not just touches, not just interactions, but quality interactions. How do you maximize even if it's a brief period of time, how do you maximize that time? And can AI help us? I think it can offload all kinds of different, administrative things and time-consuming things, and really maximize the quality of those touches.
Right.
So
That's a big issue.
that's one of the great hopes, and I really believe we can get there. All right, so we're going to move on to prediction number 4, which is we will achieve real-time medicine. AI is ushering in a new era. It's a very dynamic era where we can monitor patients and provide real-time, as you said, diagnoses, treatments, and monitor treatment plans, and even predict things like we never before, predict things before they happen. So that's really super, I think, enticing, exciting part of all of this. How is real-time medicine going to actually evolve?
It's also real-time change, because the idea is that if I can leverage data to make a decision about a medicine or a therapeutic route, it's more immediate, as opposed to waiting for the specialist, then the follow-up appointment, and the 6 weeks and 8 weeks, and next thing you know, the diagnosis to treatment window has now been truncated, so it's ongoing. I mean, banks have better hours and availability for questions and answers than we do in healthcare, which is scary. So, and we used to say you had bankers' hours. Well, now you have healthcare hours sometimes because the availability of some of these providers, although we're supposed to be available 24/7, the ability to actually make interventions and changes isn't 24/7. So this is what I really get excited about.
People's health is 24/7.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Going back, to the sort of the concept of real time, AI algorithms are continuously vigilant. They don't get bored and they don't get distracted. And if you think
They're
about
not biased.
and they're not biased. If you think about the mechanisms that avoid car crashes that are in everybody's car, they sample 50 times a second roughly, and they integrate multiple data feeds. And they're always on. They don't get distracted. And you think about heart failure, and what you see there is it's kind of a slow progression to a heart failure exacerbation. There's small changes in the central venous pressure and small changes in the myocardial pumping characteristics and probably small changes in the activity. But to the person or the person observing them, they look about the same because it's over the course of 2 weeks. But if you have that hyper-vigilant algorithm and it's equipped with the right measurement information, not chasing symptoms, but actually the hemodynamic parameters that lead to edema or myocardial dysfunction, the opportunities to have incredible improvements are there. It's hard to do, hard measurements to make, hard technology to get adopted, but I just keep thinking, wow, I would like to have an algorithm that doesn't get bored and doesn't get distracted, sitting on my shoulder watching over me as I get older.
24/7.
24/7.
I'll get back to that patient example I gave you, that common patient that fell down and was injured, maybe badly injured. And that was all, the root of all of that, if you go back, was a blood pressure issue. Maybe he had high blood pressure, maybe his primary care doctor prescribed a medicine, maybe he wasn't really taking it diligently. We didn't know that, of course. We could know that with real-time medicine. So the primary care doctor who checks that patient episodically may say maybe a week later, blood pressure is still elevated, inclined to maybe we change the dose, make it higher, maybe it happens again. Then then say the patient gets serious, well, I'm going to really start taking these medicines. And then they start taking all of them, and they become hypotensive. So that whole scenario, we could monitor all of that and prevent all of it. And it's very, very feasible. And so I think about this real-time medicine, back to that example, and that's just one of multiple different examples where, something happened and it kept building up until, like in the example of heart failure, you tipped over the edge of the Starling curve, and then everything goes, awry. But we could know all of this much earlier.
Yeah. And then the goal is really to to decrease your business in the ER, right? Because then patients aren't going there because they have the peace of mind.
Yeah.
That actually the condition is stable. Because when I talk about the medical behavioral, integration, we have to be conscious that there's a lot of unknown about, am I getting worse? Do I feel worse? I'm a little short of breath. Is it real shortness of breath? So you point about symptom versus true disease, and allowing that information to be brought to the patient, say, yes, you need care. No, you can wait till tomorrow, or you're fine, is so powerful in the way we think about the delivery of care, specifically the way the mind kind of generates a lot of our decision making, whether it's needed or not needed, based on the way we escalate services.
Yeah, and we talked before about reactive care. We're basing everything on symptoms, and the progression of symptoms, and symptoms progress and progress until they get to a certain threshold, and then the alarm goes off, and people are going to go to the emergency room or whatever they need to do at that time. But we could be monitoring all of that stuff way before people have symptoms.
If you go back a little bit to your fall example, and that's an area actually I work in, which is to say, oftentimes those medications, they decrease the sodium concentration in the blood. So they decrease the drive to drink, because elevated sodium concentration is the mechanism by which you get thirsty. So now you have an older person that is not drinking as much as they should because you've inhibited that mechanism. And then there are a number of hypertensive medications and heart failure medications that delay the autonomic response, what has to happen so you don't faint when you stand up. So now you have a situation where you're prescribing something, family practice, ER, cardiology, they're not coordinated, and you can have this cascade of medications that takes the patient's fall risk way up. So you look at that and you say, okay, is there the ability to have AI examine that? And then you move actually exactly to the monitoring of it. And the process of looking at how your body responds as you move from a laying down position to a standing position tells you exactly what the hydration status or the effective circulating volume is. And as that begins to dissipate and you see a slower response, you automatically know the person's a setup for a fall. And you can do it incredibly well with nothing more complicated than a Fitbit.
Yeah, it's wild.
Right. We talk about blood pressure, we've talked about diabetes, heart failure. There's a whole slew of different disease entities that we can monitor people and help prevent these things.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ries, should we move on to AI as the great equalizer?
Yeah, so I'm this huge believer that AI can lead to the democratization of very important information, and it's on probably the operational side. And I just go back to Zillow, and I think, wow, Zillow allows us now to understand home prices and all of that information on a website versus going through, the filings in the courthouse. So then you say, okay, well, where could that really have influence for people? Well, people today, a lot of them have high deductible plans. They need to go get an MRI. Well, I'm going to go to the hospital. Probably the most expensive place. So is there the opportunity for AI to aggregate the information and create price transparency for things that you're going to be paying for through a high deductible situation? You were talking about a hip fracture just recently, or a knee replacement. Again, how do most people get referred to a physician? It's through their friends. But you have no real transparency on the clinical outcomes. So think about it now, a tool like Zillow that says, okay, here's the information on how well Dr. Robinson actually performs knee replacements. And then the last is really understanding that unbelievably confusing area of payment through insurance. So when I think about AI and I look at it and go, okay, what could it do that would make the life of the individual person enhanced in how they access their care? And if they knew what it was going to cost, they knew the quality of the physician, and they understood what was the payment structure provided by their insurance, that'd be game-changing. And AI can aggregate that information. Today, it's available.
It's hard to find.
And it's formatted differently. You would spend, it'd take you about 5 hours to figure out where's the the best location in a city to get an MRI. I think it's, and I look at that, democratization of information. I want to just follow up on that. It does something interesting. When you democratize that information, it results in a power shift. And I think that's a really important thing. So you think about transparent pricing forces a competitive pricing and awareness of what you're charging people. And then you think visible outcomes are going to influence providers to do a better job, or the hospitals to look at that provider's care record. And then the other one is when you now understand what is paid for or not, you can avoid those huge bills that come through and you're like, I thought that was covered. And all of a sudden you've got a $2,000 bill that you thought was covered, and the stress it places on the family and the people responsible for it is huge. Let's avoid that stress.
Yeah. I think you're right. You're basically saying healthcare information is power.
Yes, and shift that power and make it available to the people, the consumers of it. Right now, it's so opaque you can't access it.
Yes.
Wow, it was a little bit of an aha moment for me, because I talked about the annual wellness visit a little while ago. The idea that is I give a patient a plan for their next 12 months, and in that plan is the potential cost that would be incurred for that individual. For me, as the provider prescribing that plan, and for the patient accepting that plan. You know, the example would be, well, maybe I'll do the Cologuard, which we know out-of-pocket costs, but I have to pay for the anesthesia for the colonoscopy, and that could be $500. So thinking about the plan to really make sure that the compliance and how we embrace those plans, I mean, that's fascinating, the idea of being able to do that.
We studied this at Presbyterian, is when you had a medication, and there's some weird interaction with the zithromycin, and when it wasn't covered, there was a 90% probability the prescription got left at the counter. And then you could track back through, and sometimes they'd show up in your office, the emergency room, with significant urinary tract infections or significant pneumonia. And you could see, well, wait, there was the opportunity, proactive again, as you pointed out, there was a script provided through an urgent care. It didn't get picked up because no one recognized it wasn't on the formulary.
So you talked about equity early on, and this is what, with this topic, you know, AI is the great equalizer. I do have some concern that not all parts of our population will immediately be able to utilize this information. And there is a risk in my mind that you know, the great opportunity is that this mitigates inequity, right? It makes all this information available, and healthcare information, people can make better decisions, but not everybody is going to use that information equally. You know, so how do we think about not having AI potentially even widen disparities? Do you worry about that at all?
I look at it and go, I don't know if you can make them wider than they are now. Think about the disparities that are present between
they're
people
huge.
that can manage the complexity of the healthcare system today. It's remarkably complicated. The other is a lot of that disparity comes through terminology, how it's presented. Mm-hmm. You know, and right now if you look at a health plan's payment structure, it's such a complicated document, I think I'm capable. I can't read it. Well, you now look at it and say, well, could you take that, use an AI translator, and put it at the right grade level for the individual? Could it be at first grade? Could it be in Spanish? I mean, I remember at Presbyterian, we didn't have it in Spanish, yet we're in New Mexico. So you look at that and you say, I think those inequities can be brought down, not exacerbated.
I think they can. I think that's just something we have to be really intentional and focused on. The other thing I think about is if we want the AI to really help with inequity, the models have to be trained on diverse populations. Yes. If they're only trained in, you know, people think about this, but I think this has to be front and center, is that if we're going to be helping different populations, the AI models need to be trained on those populations, because it's not the same. And the treatments aren't the same, the treatment effects aren't the same. So I think we have to really keep that front and center, thinking about training the AI models on diverse populations so that they actually work.
Absolutely.
We use a term I call the triangle of care. So you have the patient, the provider, and the caregiver, and all those are interconnected. So you really have to work within the system. And really, AI to me is going to become the caregiver, in the sense where it's going to help feed information to the patient and to the provider, help make change. And I think to your point about equity is that we may have to drive more information to that patient so they can understand how we're helping to advocate for them. Where maybe an affluent community may take that, go after the information because it's available to them. So we have to make sure all the information is really pushed at the right level, so that triangle of care just stays as strong regardless of the patient populations we're supporting.
Okay, number 6. Jim.
So this is clinical trials without clinics, and I will give you a little personal story. So I worked in an FQHC that was 40, 50 miles from Stony Brook University, and I lived very close to the hospital, and it was always amazed that I get these flyers or emails or information about that there were studies going on, would I want to enroll in these studies. But my patients out 40 miles away were not getting this information. So the idea now that I can have access to any study for any patient, regardless of the walls or the proximity of the Medicaid bus, transporting them to that location to have that study, to me is just a great opportunity. So I was curious, what's your feelings about that as well?
Well, not just patients live 40 miles away, but what about the 20% of the country that lives in a rural area that have literally no access to clinical trials and really are sort of, to a certain extent, been left behind, in medicine, in the evolution of medicine. I think that's one of the great potentials of clinical trials and AI, is that we can enroll and track and measure and help people that we never were able to even touch before. There's an interesting kind of collaboration that I came across I want to talk about a little bit. It's called the Blue Sky Project. And this is not brand new. It's been around for over a decade, but it was a collaboration between Pfizer and IBM to do clinical trials. And they focused, and I think they're working on a few different things, but one of the early focuses was on dementia, on Alzheimer's. And they worked with IBM to use large language learning models to actually predict dementia years, again we're getting into the before symptoms, but years before there were any symptoms that we could measure in like a standard test. And they did this with changes in voice. So there's changes, and this has been validated, there's changes that happen in your voice way before cognitive changes. And so in this project with Pfizer and IBM, monitoring patients remotely and using AI for voice technology, they've been able to predict dementia much earlier, and now working even on developing therapies that could head it off much earlier. Our dementia therapies are pretty limited. I know we have some certain drugs that are actually super expensive and have moderate treatment effect, but they're way later in sort of the dementia, way downstream when patients have had a lot of symptoms. So I was really, thought this was a great example of how AI can impact clinical trials and things like dementia.
No, that's exciting to hear. Your example of the flyers, having run a number of clinical trials, the recruiting process is so long and so difficult. And it's because it has an inherent degree of inefficiency, because you're sending out a broad area announcement to a group of people where, call it a rare disease, it's going to be 1-2% of the population have it. And then if you think about it, what you want is you want that person at a given point in their disease progression. So it's not anybody that has it, it's they're at this point where your therapy could have influence. So now you take that 1 or 2%, it becomes 0.2%. So that's why a drug costs $1 billion to develop. But part of it is because the clinical trials are so incredibly expensive. And there's been some work in trying to look at using federated learning or swarm technology to say, I'm going to go in and access the electronic medical record while maintaining the privacy and see if there's the availability of that person, and then figure out if they have the interest in it or want to be enrolled in the trial. But I think there's the opportunity to dramatically improve the efficiency of recruiting patients, and that just decreases the time in a huge way.
Yeah, I know pharmaceutical companies are really interested in this because they know they need to enroll all kinds of different patients. They can't just enroll a certain brand of patients, and the FDA will always challenge them that the findings of a clinical trial aren't translatable to broader populations. So I think now if you bring in wearables and monitoring patients at home, that's a way that you can monitor people. And there's a big problem with clinical trials of patients falling out of the trials, and they just, for multiple different reasons, they don't complete the trials. Yeah. But if you're able to stay connected with them and monitor them, I think that's much more likely that someone will finish a clinical trial. If there's a much tighter bond, where you're monitoring, you're communicating with them on a regular, maybe even daily basis. So that's one of the things that I think AI is going to be very helpful for clinical trials.
And it goes back to your point about owning the disease or the disease owning you. That type of opportunity to be part of that, so let them feel more empowered about them being a part of that disease process and controlling it, I think is very powerful.
Yeah.
I know I did see during COVID there were some clinical trials that used wearables and had some success enrolling patients, because there was a time it was really hard to get people to come in for clinical trials, so they would mail them wearable devices and would keep in touch with them via those wearable devices, and it seemed to work. All right, so I'm going to move us on to prediction 7. Now this one is a serious one. Maybe it even, depends where we go with it, but it could feel a little dystopian. But this prediction, number 7, is a brave new world of behavioral engineering. I know what that sort of elicits in my mind. I'm kind of curious when we came up with that bold prediction, how did you guys see that, or what did it bring to mind for you?
I thought about it in the framework of being able to create 100,000 email or blog responses that are tailored to that individual. The history of the conversation, their medical care, everything about them, their kids, they're personalized. 100,000 a day. And you go, wow, you could do a lot of good, and you could do a lot of bad. And I think it's very, very interesting to really, I think as you call it, that's probably the area you get the most ooh, feels a little
it's
creepy.
Gray. Yeah.
Because, the ability, the term is called framing, and it's taking the same set of facts and communicating them in a way that has a slight bias. And that can be so beneficial. Patient trying to stay in a trial or on their medications or lose weight or whatever the case is. But then if it's a bias, that is to sell a product, it's not good. Right. Or if it has actually a bias that is ethnic in its nature, it's not good. But I really look at that and I go, wow, that's such a fascinating concept to say, I could generate 100,000 personalized emails specific for that person, their condition, and have a little bias one way or the other. And how you manage that and control that, I think, is a really interesting challenge in medicine and in society.
For sure.
It's daunting to think about and a little scary to think about the idea that, just personal example, my kids and I will have a conversation at the dinner table, and the story they read in their feed versus the story I read in my feed is very different. And it's almost like there's two different stories. And that's just based on the programming and how it comes together. So when I think about this in medicine, years ago, when I was seeing patients, 40 hours a week, I was always leery of the provider who sold the creams and the pills in his office, because how could you not recommend those medicines? Because one, you believe in them, but two, you're getting a couple dollars for that. And then, the evolution of the pharmaceutical companies coming inside and giving you this pen and telling you, taking you out to the show, and we've really gotten away from that.
And by the way, before you go, so there's fascinating studies on that where a pen, a single pen given by a pharmaceutical company had measurable impact on a provider's prescribing, right. And they didn't even know it. Like it was they completely, the physicians didn't think that they had any allegiance or any bias at all, but they showed that actually a pen, I always thought was, and I remember that actually from medical school, that study, that a pen impacted your prescribing habits.
Wow. So does this DocGo pen make me log on Saturdays and Sundays and do work? I have to look into that. So the ability to help people, but then steer people, really gets me concerned, specifically with the political climate, with vaccines and supplements, take this, take that. So I'm trying to cautiously keep my eyes open, but I don't even know where to kind of land yet in terms of how this will have an impact and change things.
I also think about AI, there's a thing called AI nudging, where AI can nudge you towards, say, healthier choices, healthier habits. My Apple Watch, will tell me, probably has since we've been sitting down, I need to stand up, right?
I'm surprised you haven't actually.
It's nudging me. I normally would be standing up, but this is for you guys, I'm sitting down. But nudging, you think about it, nudging to help patients be compliant with their treatments, to be compliant with healthier lifestyles, taking their medication. You see how it could be helpful to them, but it gets to the point where it could be unhelpful. And is it even ethical when patients don't even know that the AI, what the AI is doing in the background, how it's nudging them? And when does nudging become intrusive? And so I think it's kind of a gray area. And I think you talked about the Hippocratic Oath. We have to keep at the core of all of this has to be, a patient's autonomy and their rights. And it's easy to sort of see how things could, even if it's well-intentioned, it could go too far. People then talk about, these things with behavioral health. You can send all these messages to people, and it can be incredibly helpful because it's 24/7. And patients, as you say, don't have, issues or crisis from 9 to 5. It can happen at any time. So AI can be there for them and can help them, can have real-time validated chatbots talking to people, and it can help their mental health. But at one point, does it actually become intrusive? And at one point, does it actually re-engineer our humanity? And so we're like changing what it means to be human.
It's a very interesting, as you were talking about it there, I was thinking, how do you define the difference between a nudge and a manipulate?
Mm-hmm.
That is a very gray area as you look at that process and how it is overseen and regulated and controlled. It's a very slippery slope.
I think there's a huge spectrum between what some people want and what some people don't want. Mm-hmm. Some people don't want anything, they're very much against having oversight, and some people want it and they think it'll help, but there's a huge, in our population, in our society, there's a huge there's a huge spectrum of what people want, as far as, some people view anything like that as a really negative big brother type of intrusion.
Yeah.
Because the question is, can we create a digital Hippocratic Oath? Can we create something that just kind of keeps us maybe more in check than less in check?
Yeah. And if people don't trust it, it's going to backfire. on those segments of the population.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just not going to work, it's actually going to potentially backfire. All right, so let's move on, Ries, to number 8.
So 8 is a little bit of a continuation of some of the topics we were just talking about, which is really transcending humanity into healthcare. And when I thought about this, I thought, okay, it's really interesting. We have been in this world where social media has reshaped mental health in ways we was intended, in ways we didn't. But I think about social media, and it is at its core really a one-to-many communication. When you think about the power of AI, it's a one-to-one communication. And as we step into the world where it becomes more ubiquitous, what is its role as we look to maintain humanity and empathy and many of these things that I would say at some level social media is eroded. So it really gets to be, humanity is core to the practice of medicine, and how is it maintained in a world that's going to be very different?
Your zip code determines as much your health outcomes as anything else. And so the idea that I was fortunate enough to be born in the zip code I was, and I live in the zip code I am, and the idea of being more conscious of that, and the idea of how do we kind of push through a zip codeless healthcare delivery system becomes so paramount in the way we kind of design the AIs. And maybe there should be a healthcare nudge for the providers and the systems to go into those zip codes that we know that really aren't representing the true outcomes that we're looking for. So, I'm hopeful that that equity piece is really going to help us, transcend that evaluation and that thought process.
I think about smartphones and social media and how it's dramatically changed us.
Mm-hmm.
It's dramatically changed all of us, and how we communicate and how we get information, and even just in every way it's changed us, and not all for the better. And I hope that we can sort of learn from some of that. Is we're designing these AI tools that we can be even smarter than we were early on, because it didn't, in my opinion, there's just lots of negative things that happen. Overall, good, but still a lot of negative things have happened from, sort of along the way with smartphones and social media. Okay. So let's go on to number 9. Jim, this is a big one.
Prediction 9, the metamorphosis of the traditional doctor. What's interesting, and if I think about my career and the trajectory, how things changed, I went from writing in a note. In fact, my charts didn't even have clips. We just stuck sheets of paper, and that's how old I am, to the EHR and documenting.
We had by the way, the punch thing, the T sheet that you just punched. You didn't even write. You just punched the little hole in the thing that checked it off.
Interesting. And then we morphed into the EHR, and they were never designed with the patient in mind. And I have a lot of bad jokes if you hang out with me, but one of them was that I wanted to put a big bus mirror up in front of me so I could type and look at, can you show me your rash? So I didn't have to turn around because we were so pressed for time. So the idea for me is that when I think about the interaction with the patient, I know that about 30% of the education and the advice is going to be embraced by the patients. That's not a lot, so I'm going to give some great advice in 30% of that. So if I have a 15-minute session and I have to type and manipulate and be in the chart and not engage the patient and have the experiences, then I have this much time to share, knowing that 30% of that is going to be shared. So when I think about the evolution of AI into provider relationship, and I use quality touches, that now I have almost the full 15 minutes or 30 minutes of that session to kind of be one-on-one, eye contact, embrace, feel, become empathic about what we need to do together. So that's what really gets me charged and excited.
I think about physicians coming full circle. Like back in the day, before the internet, physicians and care providers, all kinds of, we've been saying physician, but of course we're talking about all kinds of, care providers, would be with the patient, would sit with the patient. They understood the power of empathy. They understood the treatment effect of, a patient believing in their care provider, believing that something is going to help you has a huge impact on whether it actually helps you or not. Huge impact. They've known that for, that's been for centuries and centuries. And then, the last few decades, we've kind of gotten away from that. Like you said, you got pulled away because you were looking, you were looking at the screen, and you knew you had 6 minutes with the patient. Right. And so we kind of got pulled away from all of that. And I think the great potential for AI is to help us come back to now we can get back to that humanity component, the empathy component, that we can really have that and have all the other stuff running in the background. All of the analytics, the prediction, the stuff that will help us empower the patient, the data, all of that AI can provide way better than we can provide, because we of course have fatigue. AI doesn't have fatigue, and we have bias. And like it or not, we have all kinds of different biases. And I'm not just saying biases against certain types of people. Like we have biases based on things that we've seen recently. Types of diseases or conditions we've seen most recently. That influences what we think and the way we treat patients. AI doesn't have any of that. So it can do all kinds of things that we cannot do, but we can get back to what we can do really well that AI can't do. So really coming full circle.
Yeah, I think you guys have really hit on something, which is, during the classic physician visit, the amount of time you're one-on-one, touching the person, looking in them in the eye, in general you want to maximize it. And we spent a lot of time at Presbyterian trying to figure out, okay, how do we improve the happiness of our providers and their net efficiency? And as we began to look at it, it was very interesting to see when you interviewed them, there were two things that often overwhelmed them. And one was the expansion of the medical information in general. So I looked up a couple numbers. It was interesting. Healthcare information doubled 50 years ago. So in 1950, it doubled. That number from 50 years of doubling went to 3.5 by 2010. And it's now less than 100 days. So there are 3,000 PubMed articles issued every day. So you think about that, there's no capacity for any person to stay current. There's no capacity. Then the second thing, and I'm very cognizant of this, is, as you have patients come in, I'm sure you've seen this, they've been in the hospital and they come back and there's a 90-page PDF. Yep. And that's where you're scrolling through it. You're not interacting with the patient. You're trying to figure it out. And then if you ask the patient, they're terrible historians. Mm-hmm. So now you're operating blind, in part, because of the limitation of time. You're actually not communicating with the individual. So I always look at this, the title is, what's the trajectory of the traditional physician? And I think of the traditional physician having been educated in medical school and having this incredible repository of facts that they applied over their career. And that image is gone. And I think of the evolving doctor is this just extraordinarily agile digital athlete that understands the tools to integrate the existing information on that patient, has the tools at their disposal that say, this medication is ideal, it was approved this morning. And also that ability to know if they can afford it. Mm-hmm. Don't give them a prescription they can't afford. So I really think it's such a fascinating transition to say, what you're now asking that individual to do is be an elite digital information integrator on one hand, and be an extraordinary, empathetic, communicator on the other to encourage and inform the patient to do what they can do best. That's a tough challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a
lot of
really,
training. A lot of
really
training.
interesting challenge to create that person that does that efficiently, effectively, and doesn't come through like they're just trying to process you.
I love that idea of physicians as elite digital athletes. And that takes a ton of training for them to learn how to do that. I remember, the first day of medical school decades ago, they said, of course, they said this to all of us, that first day they said, half of what you're going to learn here is going to be, by the time you get done, it's going to be obsolete. Problem is we just can't tell you which half. And now I think it's more like 80% of what we're training you and teaching you right now is going to be, in just a short period of time, going to either be obsolete or shown to maybe even be wrong. We just can't tell you which 80%. But I like that idea that young healthcare providers need to be intentionally trained in how to harness AI, how to utilize it. And I think there is still some, a little bit of combativeness, just because it's so new and people, it's easy to want to push it back as opposed to embrace it and figure out how to really harness the potential of it.
So my brother-in-law is a family practice physician, and when I see him or we go somewhere, he's always asking me, okay, tell me about the latest AI tools you're using. What are you using here? What are you using here? How are you doing this? Right. And what I find is if you're in that world of trying to stay fluent with those, the rate at which they're changing is yet again a problem to keep up with. So now you have the tools are changing to do it. You have the information content is changing. It's a real challenge, and I think it leads to the burnout of physicians. And then the other thing, and you mentioned this, is, my goodness, we've got to get them out of doing these rote activities like prescription refill. I mean, that's an activity that can be automated. There are questions, maybe you need to do lab results, but we had 45 minutes a day with what a primary care physician was spending on physician refills at Presbyterian. That is a waste of cognitive energy, effort, and time. We've got to get those out of the system.
Right. It's interesting that we have to think that empathy is the evergreen. Like that's the forever part of medicine, despite all the technology. And what we try to teach the team members who come on board with us is that I want you to bookend empathy. I want you to think about the first minute of your session, that you just let a patient speak, you don't interrupt, you give them eye contact, you embrace what they're saying, because I want you to create that connection. Then you can document, you do whatever you need to do, you look at your data, whether you did beforehand or not. And then at the end, the same thing. Let's give empathy, let's share advice, let's share a plan together, so that if we can bookend empathy on the front and the back end, then we've created the efficiency of the story. Because the story is all about not just what's written in the note, but what's felt in the way we empower that session and that visit. So that becomes so important. So we can't lose track of the real power of the empathy with technology. Yeah.
The other one I think is then because many times patients are frazzled enough, they do not hear a lot of what you say. It's the ability then to take that information that you provided, and I'm assuming an empathetic doctor is using terminology and references that are resonating because they're getting that feedback, and then be able to reinforce that. Because the note you would write to them, which doesn't really occur, or the follow-up, it's all kind of standardized, the terminology and the structure would be very different than the conversation. If you could reinforce the conversation, it'd have more impact.
Right.
I think this is one of the themes that we keep touching on, is that there's things that AI can do that we cannot do well or cannot do at all. Things about enormous amounts of processing data, scouring, data, papers, updating information that we just cannot stay updated on, finding trends and things that we just can't. There's too much computational, necessity that we're not able to do it. But there's things that we do that AI, in my opinion, will not be able to do, certainly not be able to do well. And empathy, one of them, but the other two I think about is judgment. Judgment, empathy, and then the third one is presence. Empathy is not going to be there with somebody and really provide that reassurance, which is really what patients, in lots of cases actually need.
Right.
So empathy for sure, but judgment, empathy, and presence are the things, some of the things that we can do that we have to focus on, and maybe AI finally helps us get back to that.
Right, that's great, because the way you describe that really creates the envelope of care. That kind of helps wrap, all the needs of what that patient's looking for. So that's great.
AI will never create physical touch. Can't.
So, okay, so let's get on to our final bold prediction, which is the ethical frontier of AI medicine. In my view, again, I said this at the beginning, I think that we're getting into uncharted territory. It's high risk, high reward. And I think that everybody should be part of this. It's not, in my mind, not really a revolution, but should be an evolution, a very well planned, thought out, methodical evolution. Because some of this stuff, we don't know exactly how it's going to go. And we have to be very, very mindful about how we implement these things and measure them and make sure that they're having the intended impact on people and health and health systems. But one of the other things I want to bring up that I hope we'll talk about a little bit is consent, about patients' consent. A lot of these, consent is a huge issue, and we're sort of assuming a little bit that people will consent to having AI as part of their health care. And so I just want to bring that up.
What's interesting is we've gotten more involved with value-based propositions and thinking about how we can help a patient population. I worry about, will I avoid a patient population? And we talked about the ethics in doing no harm.
Accidentally overlook.
Yes,
Yeah.
Right. Or targeting a patient population I'm only going to be successful in. We do really well with diabetics, hypertensives, or whatever our program is that somebody's created, and we're avoiding other patient populations. So I just want to be conscious of the fact that, to me, it's important to kind of stay true to, you want to help everybody. We really want to make sure care is designed and derived to really help everyone, and not kind of, to your point earlier, a subset of different populations can have the access and engagement that they need.
The ethical frontier of AI is significant. Many of the things we talked about, whether it be, you're talking about, cherry picking patients for a health plan by, really understanding where a select group of individuals are going to be present or how you attract them. And we talked about that in a really interesting fashion. We talked about how it could benefit clinical trials. You could identify a particular population with remarkable resolution. I run a health plan. Be good if I got a whole bunch of really healthy people. Now I have the capability of identifying, in a very similar manner, using the same tools, individuals that are likely to produce a lower medical loss ratio. And how that is governed will be difficult, because we know in the society we live in that the dollar revenue will force people to pursue paths that they shouldn't. And I don't think it's government oversight, because the government just simply moves too slow. I've been really a believer that the FDA process in the United States, it adds probably 5 years to a drug medication relative to Europe. I'm like, I don't know, do we really need that extra 5 years of paperwork and expense? So I don't have an answer there to say is how does the society, as well as the companies that create these products, how do they manage them effectively? What I will say, and I was involved in a very interesting presentation in Washington by an individual that worked only in sort of the area of you'd really call it manipulation of society by extremist groups. And they would come back and they'd identify websites or blogs or things that were really incorrect. And boy, the social media companies went, oh yeah, okay, thank you. And not much happened. Right. So the self-regulation by social media has been poor. So for us to expect that the self-regulation by artificial intelligence will be better, I think that'd be a fallacy. And how that's solved, I don't have a good answer.
Should there be some type of oversight?
Probably.
Usually when there's not, things can go.
Well, let's ask the question, should there be additional oversight on social media? There isn't much.
Yeah, well, the
Not
freedom of
still.
speech versus facts. I think that's where the gray area is, and I think that we have to figure out a way to let the true facts, based on the studies and all the articles that come out, to help really guide, really cite the information that's out there, so we can make the best decision.
And how do we make sure we stay laser focused on people's dignity and fairness? It's easy with the incentives as they are. There's a lot of monetary incentives for health systems and health plans that people without oversight, there could be. It's not hard to imagine people using the information for things that aren't specifically in patients' best interest.
Yeah.
I do think, you mentioned earlier the training of artificial intelligence models. That is a more solvable issue, which is to say, if the information used is curated, you think about UpToDate or other tools that have highly curated information upon which they build opinions, experts involved, you train an AI model on that information, it should, in general, give a very good result, one that is valid and not influenced at a disproportionate level by false information. But when you think about, frontier models that just gobble the internet, your ability to influence those will become omnipresent as you move forward. We've seen that in elections and other opinions. Fun stuff.
Exciting stuff. So let's round this out. Let me ask you each, what excites you most about AI in healthcare? Jim, you go first.
Well, just to kind of pull some of the themes from earlier, I'm excited by actually spending more time with patients. That's really what it comes down to. They actually have those interactions. That's where the excitement is, to have information at my fingertips, prep for me, help facilitate, create a plan that's fully integrated with the patient. That's the really piece to me that excites me, that finally, after years and years and years of having to do more and more and more in terms of documenting and following up and ordering this and prioritization of this, that I feel like I'll be a provider and not just a facilitator of paperwork and information. So that's, I think, the thing that jumped out at me when I think about where things are going.
That AI will actually not hinder, but will amplify the human touch.
Exactly.
I like it.
Yeah, I just follow on with you. I think about it, efficiency and effectiveness. And the provider is the pivotal point, because they're the entity most involved in care. And if you can make them more effective, aggregating information, making them aware of new care, all of the totality of the information, and packaging it in a way they can react to it efficiently, is of huge benefit. The other is on the efficiency. And I think the one place that we haven't talked about, because we've had a care-centric activity, but when you look at the expense of healthcare in the United States, it's astronomical. And when you dig into it, it's not all the physicians have made an astronomical amount of more money. It's really the disproportionate growth in the administrative overhead. And when you think about that, you have, I'll use a specific example, processing a podiatry claim was 125 clicks. 125 clicks. And it wasn't that simple. You had to enter a lot of information and move it through. We ended up automating it with a robot. But that type of activity, if you could decrease the administrative costs in healthcare, there's real savings there.
Yes.
Instead of attacking the benefits that patients receive, let's attack the inefficiencies that are present.
And AI can definitely do those things.
It's great at repetitive tasks.
Yes. I agree with all of those things that excite you guys. I think if I really am honest, what most motivates me and most encourages me is back to the first one we had. The first bold prediction was really about proactive care. And again, the idea that we're not just continuously putting Band-Aids on things and patching people up and trying to, as I like to say, rescue them as they've fallen in the river and they're floating by. We're actually going upstream and figuring it out and preventing people from falling in the river. The AI can actually enable us to do that. That's what is really the most kind of encouraging thing for me, the ability to do that.
It's that old statement, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of
these
cure.
aren't new concepts.
Because you're right. It's that we run that turnstile. We don't keep people well, we treat people that have become sick.
Right.
And until we make that paradigm change, we'll always be reactive instead of proactive. And I think that's where you really change the course of medicine. Now you've got to get payment and structures in the government and the other advocacy groups aligned with it, but that starts with screening. Starts with screening. Yeah. Let's reimburse screening.
Yeah. So in my mind, that's one of the really, just paradigm shifting things
big paradigm.
Is being proactive and helping people even before they know they need help. Okay, so now I'm going to flip it around. What keeps you up at night worrying about this stuff? What really do you see as the most potentially negative things about AI in healthcare?
I think it's the ability to create an enormous amount of content that has bias. People still use Dr. Google for many, many things. And the ability to create an extraordinary amount of content that has a bias towards a drug or a treatment or a facility or something of that nature, it's unmitigated and unregulated now. And I think that does a disservice to people, society, and those that aren't employing those tools.
That's a good point. I think the dichotomy that was brought up a little earlier, it's financial, it's health, but we live in a country where there's not even equal distribution of internet access. And so when you think about that, we can't even offer the same opportunities to individuals when AI is going to leverage access information to reach out to people. Is that going to become a problem? So I'm just concerned that we're just going to separate more as opposed to pulling everybody together towards that bell-shaped curve.
Definitely. I think I think we have a tendency, what I've seen is, we get enamored with the next bright, shiny thing. And we always want a quick fix. That's just human nature. Fix it now. I'd like to take a pill, to fix it. It doesn't work like that. And I don't think this works like that, as we've talked about. The answers to these questions, are likely very nuanced, kind of complicated things that require a combination of, systematic changes and integration and training and training, the next generation of providers to understand how to properly utilize AI, so it can help them and help patients and not just sort of, push a button and say, okay, talk to the bot. The bot will figure it out, My fear is that in some cases it's going to be tempting to push the button and want people, and I don't think it'll work. I don't think patients are going to accept it. It's not going to help them, but people will try to take shortcuts, and that's one thing that with AI that I think we have to really be very vigilant about, and I think it has enormous potential to help us do better and be better, but it has to be implemented in a very, very mindful way, and that's one of the things I think about.
We were talking about that oversight of AI, and I was trying to get there, and I failed to get there, but It's very interesting. I think most people look at Underwriters Laboratory as a government activity, the people that put the little UL sticker on every appliance that you have. It's not the government. It's a private industry activity that operates at the speed of the market, not the speed of the government. And I think there's really an interesting opportunity to take that type of industry initiative. It's separate from industry. It's not controlled by industry, but it's separate from industry to create that oversight. Because if the government does it, it will move too slow. It doesn't have the wherewithal to do that. And if you ask industry to self-regulate, they will not. And I think it's a really interesting example of where the Underwriters Laboratory has evolved compliance standards, approval activities, and operated at the speed of the market, creating assurances that a product is safe and reasonable. Now, so when you adopt a tool to use for AI, whatever it may be in a given sector, if it was UL, quote, AI approved, something of that nature, I think that'd be a great place to start with the oversight.
Well, that's pretty much, I think we achieved our goal of working through those 10 bold predictions. I learned a lot from both of you guys. I really appreciated it.
Thank you both.
Super interesting to me. I think, I'm really excited that DocGo is a company that's committed to these things. DocGo, of course, their vision is to provide the best mobile healthcare and to be proactive. And so this really is in the philosophy of DocGo. And DocGo, I think it says something that they've put a lot of time and energy and thought and work into this and into developing, these ideas and these roadmaps that DocGo I know wants to implement. And so it's a great honor to me to be part of this with you guys, with the DocGo Medical Advisory Board. And I look forward to our next conversation about this stuff.